There's a portrait in the Georgia Historical Society archives that visitors always stop to examine, though few can articulate why it unsettles them so deeply. The painting, dated 1834, shows a young black woman in simple clothing, her face turned 3/4 toward the viewer. But it's her eyes that arrest attention and refuse to release it. Her left eye is a deep, rich brown, dark as Georgia soil. Her right eye is a startling pale blue, the color of winter sky. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plate reads simply, Celeste, executed for witchcraft, Savannah, Georgia, 1847. Before we begin this journey into one of Georgia's most disturbing historical mysteries, please leave a comment below with your location and current time. We're fascinated to learn how far these documented accounts travel and at what hours people seek out these darker chapters of American history. Between that portrait's creation and that execution lies one of the most disturbing and inexplicable cases in Georgia history. A story where 3 men died under circumstances that defied medical explanation. Where an enslaved woman with unusual eyes became the focus of a community's supernatural terror. Where testimony under oath claimed impossible things. And where, even today, over 170 years later, people report seeing those mismatched eyes watching from the darkness of Georgia swamps. This is not simply a story about slavery's cruelty or superstition's power. This is a story about what happens when justice, fear, and the possibility of the genuinely inexplicable collide. This is the story of Celeste of Savannah, and the question that remains unanswered. Was she a poisoner using her knowledge to exact revenge, or was she something else entirely? Celeste was born in 1821 on the Whitfield plantation, approximately 15 miles outside Savannah, to an enslaved woman named Marie. The circumstances of her birth were unremarkable by the brutal standards of the time, except for one detail that would define her entire existence. She emerged into the world with heterochromia, a genetic condition resulting in 2 different colored eyes. Her left eye was brown, typical of her African ancestry. Her right eye was a pale, almost translucent blue that seemed to glow with its own light and certain illumination. Marie, who had been born in Haiti and retained knowledge of Vodou traditions despite the violence used to suppress such beliefs, recognized immediately that her daughter would be marked as different, as dangerous by both the enslaved community and their white oppressors. In Vodou tradition, such eyes were considered a sign of spiritual sight, the ability to perceive what others could not. But in Georgia in 1821, where any deviation from expected norms was viewed with suspicion, Marie knew her daughter's eyes would bring nothing but trouble. The white overseers and the plantation owner, Colonel Marcus Whitfield, were disturbed by the infant's appearance. There was talk of selling her immediately, of getting rid of this unsettling presence before she brought bad luck to the plantation. But Marie pleaded desperately, promising the child would be useful, would work hard, would cause no trouble. Colonel Whitfield agreed to keep the child, but with a warning. Those eyes are the devil's mark. That girl brings any misfortune to this place, and I'll have her whipped until those eyes are beaten shut. Celeste grew up under this constant threat, learning early that her very appearance was considered evidence of something wrong, something evil. The other enslaved children were warned by their parents not to look directly at Celeste's eyes, especially not the blue one, which was said to carry curses. Celeste learned to walk with her head down, her gaze averted, trying to make herself as invisible as someone with such visible difference could possibly be. But children are curious, and some of the bolder ones would sneak glances at her face, fascinated by the mismatched eyes. They would whisper that she could see ghosts with that blue eye, that she could look into your soul and know your secrets, that if she stared at you too long, bad things would happen. These were just the superstitions of frightened children, but they planted seeds that would later grow into something far more dangerous. Marie tried to teach Celeste the old ways, the knowledge passed down from her own grandmother who had been born free in Haiti before being captured and enslaved. She taught her daughter about plants, about which leaves could heal and which could harm, about the spirits that inhabited the natural world, about how to protect oneself through ritual and knowledge. But she also warned Celeste repeatedly and desperately never to use this knowledge where others could see, never to give them reason to confirm their superstitions, never to draw attention to herself in any way. "Your eyes already mark you," Marie told her daughter when Celeste was 8 years old. "People fear what they don't understand and they destroy what they fear. You must be smaller than small, quieter than quiet. You must make them forget you exist." Celeste tried. She worked in the fields, her head down, her movements efficient but unremarkable. She spoke only when spoken to, and then in the softest possible voice. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, showing those unsettling eyes as little as possible. But no matter how small she made herself, she could not escape the whispers, the sidelong glances, the way people stepped aside when she approached, as though her very presence might contaminate them. When Celeste was 13, Marie died of fever. Celeste's last protection was gone. She was alone on the Whitfield plantation with nothing but the knowledge her mother had passed down and the curse of the eyes she had been born with. The first death occurred in the summer of 1834. Jonathan Mercer was the overseer on the Whitfield plantation, a position that gave him absolute power over the enslaved people who worked there. He was known for his cruelty even in a context where cruelty was normalized. He took particular pleasure in finding reasons to punish, in inflicting pain, in exercising his authority in the most brutal ways possible. Celeste, now 13, had managed to avoid his direct attention for years through her strategy of invisibility. But in June of 1834, that changed. Celeste was working in the fields when Mercer approached. He had been drinking, which always made him more volatile, more likely to find fault. He ordered Celeste to look at him when he spoke to her. Celeste, trained to keep her gaze down, hesitated. "I said, look at me, girl," Mercer shouted, grabbing her chin and forcing her face up. He found himself staring directly into Celeste's mismatched eyes, one brown, one that pale, unsettling blue. For a moment they stood frozen, Celeste's eyes locked with Mercer's. Then Mercer released her violently, stepping back as though he had touched something burning. "Witch eyes," he muttered. "Devil's mark. I should beat that evil out of you." But he didn't. He walked away and Celeste returned to her work, her heart pounding, knowing she had just drawn the worst kind of attention. That evening, Mercer complained to his wife about feeling unwell. By nightfall, he was experiencing severe pain in his abdomen. By dawn, he was dead. The plantation doctor, called to examine the body, could find no clear cause of death. The symptoms suggested some kind of poisoning, but Mercer had eaten the same food as his wife, who showed no illness. There was no obvious source for any toxin. The doctor's official report listed the cause as sudden fever of unknown origin, but privately he was baffled. Mercer had been a relatively healthy man in his late 30s. His sudden death from no apparent cause was medically inexplicable. But the enslaved community had an explanation. "That girl with the witch eyes," they whispered. Mercer made her look at him, made her use that blue eye on him. That eye sees death, and when you make her use it, death sees you back. This was, of course, superstition born of fear and desperation. But it spread quickly through the plantation and beyond, carried by the informal networks through which enslaved people communicated despite all efforts to prevent such connections. Celeste became more marked than ever. Now she wasn't just the girl with unusual eyes. She was the girl whose eyes had killed a man. Colonel Whitfield heard the rumors. He was an educated man who prided himself on his rationality, and he had no patience for supernatural nonsense. But he also recognized that a plantation operated on a delicate balance of fear and compliance, and having enslaved people believe one of their own possessed deadly supernatural powers could disrupt that balance in unpredictable ways. He called Celeste to the main house. "Did you do something to Mercer?" he demanded. "No, sir," Celeste replied, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. "Never touched him, sir. Never gave him anything, sir. Just worked in the fields like always, sir." Whitfield studied her for a long moment. Everything in his rational education told him this was coincidence. Mercer had died of some internal ailment that the doctor had failed to identify. But looking at those unsettling eyes, one brown, one that pale blue that seemed to catch light strangely, he felt an involuntary shiver of superstitious dread. "You stay away from the main house," he ordered. "You work in the furthest fields. And you keep those devil eyes pointed at the ground. You look at me or any other white person directly again, and I'll have you sold so far south you'll never see Savannah again." Celeste nodded and left, relief warring with fear. She had survived the immediate danger, but the whispers had started, and once such whispers began, they never truly stopped. For 4 years, Celeste worked in the far fields, keeping her head down, speaking to no one, trying desperately to disappear back into anonymity. But in 1838, Colonel Whitfield died of natural causes, and his son, James Whitfield, inherited the plantation. James was younger than his father, more volatile, and even less concerned with the welfare of the people he owned. He had heard the stories about Celeste and her supposed cursed eyes, and unlike his father, James was drawn to such stories rather than repelled by them. He began going out to the far fields where Celeste worked, watching her, asking other slaves about her, collecting stories about the death of Jonathan Mercer and the supernatural attributes ascribed to her. In his mind, he began to romanticize her, to see her as some kind of exotic, dangerous creature rather than a human being suffering under his ownership. In the spring of 1839, James made his intentions clear. He ordered Celeste brought to the main house to work as his personal servant. This was the worst possible fate for an enslaved woman, and everyone understood what personal servant implied. Celeste had no choice but to comply. James's obsession with her grew over the following months. He would make her look at him, fascinated by her mismatched eyes. He would ask her about voodoo, about curses, about whether she really had killed Mercer with her gaze. Celeste denied everything, played the role of ignorant field hand who knew nothing of such matters. But James didn't believe her. He wanted to believe she had power because it made his obsession with her feel more significant, more forbidden, more exciting. The other house servants watched with horror as James's fixation intensified. They knew where this would lead, and they were powerless to prevent it. By the winter of 1840, James had begun forcing himself on Celeste regularly, his actions justified in his mind by the fact that she was his property, and therefore his to do with as he wished. But something changed in Celeste during this period. The girl who had spent her entire life trying to be invisible, to avoid attention, to survive through submission, began to harden. In her small room at night, she would remember her mother's teachings. She would think about the plants Marie had shown her, about which leaves could heal and which could kill. She began to plan. In early 1842, James began experiencing strange symptoms. He complained of vivid nightmares, of waking in the middle of the night unable to breathe, of a sensation of weight on his chest as though something invisible was sitting on him while he slept. His wife, concerned, called for doctors. They examined him and found nothing physically wrong. They prescribed rest, fresh air, exercise. The symptoms continued and worsened. James began to speak of seeing things at the edge of his vision, of shadows that moved when they shouldn't, of hearing whispers in empty rooms. His mental state deteriorated rapidly. He became paranoid, convinced that someone was trying to kill him through supernatural means. In a moment of terrified clarity, he remembered Celeste, the girl with the witch eyes, the girl he had been forcing himself on for over a year, the girl who was said to have killed Jonathan Mercer by looking at him. In February of 1842, James called Celeste to his study. "You're doing this to me," he said, his voice shaking. "You've cursed me. With those devil eyes, you've put some kind of spell on me." Celeste stood silently, her gaze lowered as always. "Look at me," James screamed. Celeste slowly raised her eyes to meet his. For a long moment they stared at each other, her mismatched eyes locked with his increasingly wild gaze. Then James whispered, "You are going to kill me, aren't you? Just like you killed Mercer." Celeste said nothing. What could she say? Any denial would sound like a lie, any admission would mean immediate execution. So she simply held his gaze, her face expressionless, and waited. James broke first, looking away, trembling. "Get out," he whispered. "Get out before I have you burned at the stake." Celeste left and James collapsed in his chair, his heart racing. That night, James Whitfield died in his sleep. His wife found him in the morning lying in bed, his eyes wide open, his face frozen in an expression of terror. There was no mark on his body, no sign of violence or illness. The doctor who examined him was the same one who had examined Jonathan Mercer 8 years earlier. He recorded the death as heart failure brought on by severe agitation and nervous disorder. But privately, he was disturbed by the similarities to Mercer's death. Both sudden, both in seemingly healthy men, both defying easy medical explanation. After James Whitfield's death, his widow, Margaret, became obsessed with finding an explanation. She had heard the stories about Celeste, about the witch eyes, about Jonathan Mercer's death 8 years earlier. She demanded that the sheriff investigate. Sheriff William Thompson was like Colonel Whitfield before him, a man who prided himself on rationality. But he also recognized that 2 unexplained deaths connected to the same enslaved woman warranted examination. He interviewed everyone on the plantation. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Multiple people testified that both Mercer and James Whitfield had forced Celeste to look directly at them shortly before their deaths. Both men had experienced strange symptoms in the days or weeks leading to their deaths, symptoms that seemed to have no medical basis. And critically, other enslaved people testified that Celeste was known to disappear into the swamps surrounding the plantation for hours at a time, returning with plants and herbs that she dried and stored in her quarters. The sheriff ordered Celeste's room searched. They found bundles of dried plants, some of which the sheriff didn't recognize. A botanist was brought in to examine them. He identified several specimens as having medicinal properties when prepared correctly, but toxic properties when prepared differently. He couldn't definitively say that Celeste had used these plants to poison anyone, as there was no physical evidence linking her to the deaths. The plants could have been for healing purposes, as enslaved people often had to treat their own medical conditions. But the discovery provided enough justification for the sheriff to hold Celeste for questioning. During interrogation, Celeste maintained her innocence. She admitted to gathering plants for medicinal purposes as her mother had taught her. She denied using them to harm anyone. She denied having any supernatural powers despite what people said about her eyes. The sheriff pressed her about her knowledge of Vodou and African spiritual traditions. Celeste insisted she knew nothing of such matters, that she was a Christian who attended the plantation's Sunday services like all the other slaves. But her denials rang hollow to people who wanted to believe in her guilt. The coincidence seemed too great. 2 men dead under mysterious circumstances, both connected to an enslaved woman with unusual eyes and knowledge of plants. Surely this couldn't be mere chance. After 3 weeks, the sheriff released Celeste due to lack of concrete evidence. He couldn't prove she had poisoned anyone. The botanical specimens, while potentially dangerous, weren't illegal for her to possess, and the eyewitness testimony about her looking at the men before they died proved nothing more than the existence of superstitious belief. But releasing her didn't end the matter. The rumors intensified. Celeste became known throughout the Savannah area as the witch slave, the girl who could kill with her eyes. Other plantation owners refused to purchase her when Margaret Whitfield, desperate to be rid of her, tried to sell her. No one wanted to bring that curse onto their property. So Celeste remained on Whitfield Plantation, more isolated than ever, feared by everyone, both white and black. The enslaved community kept their distance, terrified that looking at her or speaking to her might draw her deadly attention. The white overseers avoided giving her any orders that might force her to look at them directly. She existed in a strange state of quarantine, simultaneously watched constantly and left completely alone. During these years, according to later testimony, Celeste's personality changed. The quiet, submissive girl who had tried so hard to disappear became harder, colder. She stopped avoiding people's gazes. Instead, she would stare directly at anyone who came near her, her mismatched eyes unflinching. If she couldn't make people forget her presence, she would make them fear it so much they stayed away entirely. The strategy worked. People would cross to the other side of a road rather than pass close to where she worked. They would refuse to sleep in quarters near hers. They treated her as though she were a loaded weapon that might discharge at any moment if disturbed, and in 1845 that loaded weapon found its final target. In the summer of 1845, Margaret Whitfield remarried. Her new husband was a man named Richard Ashford, a merchant from Charleston who had heard stories about the supposedly cursed slave on the Whitfield plantation but dismissed them as provincial superstition. When he arrived to take up residence, he made a point of confronting these stories head-on. He ordered Celeste brought to him so he could see for himself this woman with the supposed witch eyes. Celeste was brought to the main house, where Richard Ashford stood waiting. "So you're the famous witch," he said mockingly. "Let me see these cursed eyes everyone fears so much." Celeste raised her gaze to meet his. Richard found himself staring into her mismatched eyes, one brown, one that pale, startling blue. For a moment he felt an involuntary chill. There was something unnerving about those eyes, something that made his rational mind recoil even as he forced himself to maintain his skeptical stance. "Unusual," he admitted, "but hardly supernatural, just a genetic quirk, nothing to fear." He ordered Celeste back to work, satisfied that he had proven himself braver and more rational than his new neighbors. But Richard Ashford was also a cruel man who enjoyed exercising power, and having demonstrated he wasn't afraid of Celeste, he began to use her as a way to prove his dominance. He would order her to look at him directly, forcing her to meet his gaze, then laugh at the discomfort of the other house servants who witnessed these interactions. He made a game of it, of demonstrating his fearlessness while terrifying everyone around him. For months, Celeste endured this psychological torture. Every day, Richard would summon her, would make her look into his eyes while he mocked her, would ask if she was going to curse him like she supposedly cursed the others, would laugh at her silent endurance. The house servants later testified that during this period, Celeste's demeanor changed dramatically. She stopped showing any expression at all. Her face became a mask, her movements mechanical. The only thing that seemed alive about her were her eyes, which would fix on Richard Ashford with an intensity that made observers deeply uncomfortable. In December of 1845, Richard began experiencing strange symptoms. At first, it was just difficulty sleeping, nightmares that left him exhausted. Then he began having episodes of disorientation during the day, moments where he would lose track of time, find himself in parts of the house with no memory of having walked there. He consulted doctors who could find nothing physically wrong with him. They suggested his symptoms might be stress-related, perhaps adjustment to his new life in Georgia after years in Charleston. But the symptoms intensified. Richard began seeing things that weren't there, brief hallucinations at the edges of his vision, shadows that moved wrong, faces in windows that vanished when he looked directly at them. He became convinced he was being watched, that something was following him, waiting for its moment. In January of 1846, during one of his episodes of forced eye contact with Celeste, Richard noticed something that chilled him. In the reflection of her blue eye, he thought he saw his own face, but older, decayed, dead. He blinked, and the vision was gone, but the image stayed with him, haunting his dreams. He began to avoid Celeste, no longer calling her to him, no longer playing his game of demonstrating fearlessness. But the damage was done. In March of 1846, Richard Ashford died. Like the two men before him, his death was sudden and medically inexplicable. He had seemed relatively healthy the night before, despite his psychological symptoms. He went to bed and simply never woke up. His wife found him in the morning, his eyes open, staring at nothing, his body already cold. The doctor who examined him was now examining the third unexplained death connected to the same woman. The cause was listed as sudden cessation of heart function, but the doctor noted in his private journal that he had never seen 3 such similar deaths, all involving the same person, all defying clear medical explanation. This time, there was no question of releasing Celeste for lack of evidence. 3 men connected to her were dead under mysterious circumstances. The community's fear had reached a breaking point. She was arrested immediately and held in Savannah's jail, charged with 3 counts of murder through witchcraft. The charge itself was unusual. Georgia law, like most American law in the 1840s, didn't officially recognize witchcraft as a real phenomenon. But public pressure and fear demanded action. And so the charge was framed as murder through unnatural means and forbidden knowledge, which allowed prosecutors to avoid explicitly endorsing belief in supernatural power while still addressing the community's terror. The trial began in October of 1846 and became a sensation. People traveled from across Georgia and neighboring states to witness what newspapers called the last witch trial in America. The prosecution's case rested on several elements. The testimony of multiple witnesses that all 3 victims had been forced to look directly at Celeste's eyes shortly before their deaths. The botanical evidence from Celeste's quarters showing she possessed knowledge of toxic plants, and the sheer statistical improbability that 3 men would die under such similar mysterious circumstances, all connected to the same person without that person being responsible. The defense faced an impossible task. They couldn't prove Celeste was innocent without proving a negative, that she hadn't used supernatural powers, which is logically impossible. They tried to argue that the deaths were coincidental, that Mercer, Whitfield, and Ashford had died of natural causes that medicine simply couldn't identify. They pointed out that there was no physical evidence linking Celeste to any poisoning, but their arguments fell flat against the weight of superstitious fear and the testimony of dozens of witnesses. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution asked Celeste to look directly at the judge and jury. The defense objected strenuously, arguing that this was a transparent attempt to terrify the jury through exploiting their superstitions. But the judge allowed it, curious himself about these supposedly cursed eyes. Celeste, who had been sitting with her gaze lowered throughout the trial, slowly raised her head. She turned her face toward the jury box. One by one, she made eye contact with each of the 12 men who would decide her fate. Several jurors visibly flinched. One refused to meet her gaze, looking away and making the sign of the cross. Celeste's face remained expressionless, but her mismatched eyes seemed to bore into each man, that pale blue eye catching the courtroom light in an unsettling way. After she had stared at each juror for several long seconds, Celeste returned her gaze to her lap. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge called for order. One juror raised his hand and asked to be excused from service, claiming he felt suddenly unwell. The judge denied the request, but the damage was done. The jury had been thoroughly intimidated. During deliberations, which lasted only 3 hours, several jurors later admitted that their verdict was influenced not by the evidence, but by fear. They were terrified that if they acquitted Celeste, she might curse them, might use those witch eyes on them, might kill them as she had supposedly killed Mercer, Whitfield, and Ashford. The verdict was guilty on all 3 counts. The judge sentenced Celeste to death by hanging. Under Georgia law, this was the standard punishment for murder by enslaved people. But the judge added an unusual addendum. Before the execution, Celeste's eyes were to be covered with a black cloth, which was not to be removed under any circumstances. This detail, added out of superstitious precaution, would later fuel endless speculation about what authorities truly believed about Celeste's powers. The execution was scheduled for April 15, 1847. In the weeks between her sentencing and execution, Celeste was kept in isolation, her eyes constantly covered with black cloth except when she was eating, and even then guards would leave her food and retreat before the blindfold was removed. She spoke to no one, accepted no visitors, spent her final weeks in darkness. The execution drew an enormous crowd. Thousands gathered to witness the death of the witch slave, the girl with the cursed eyes. Among them were journalists, traveling ministers, curiosity seekers, and people genuinely terrified that something supernatural might occur during the hanging. A minister visited Celeste in her cell on the morning of the execution, attempting to extract a final confession. What he heard would remain controversial for over a century. According to the minister's later testimony, Celeste finally spoke, and what she said was chilling in its ambiguity. "I never used my eyes to kill anyone," she said. "These eyes are just eyes. They see what others see, nothing more. But I did kill them, not with curses, not with the evil eye, with plants. With knowledge my mother gave me. Mercer, Whitfield, Ashford, I poisoned them all, added my preparations to their food, their drink, slowly over weeks. By the time they died, the evidence was gone from their bodies. Your doctors couldn't find it because they didn't know what to look for." The minister asked why she had confessed now, after maintaining her innocence throughout the trial. Celeste's response was captured in the minister's journal. "Because letting them believe in magic is more powerful than letting them know it was simple poison. They'll fear these eyes forever, even after I'm dead. Every slave with unusual eyes will benefit from that fear. Every owner who looks at their slaves will wonder if one of them has the knowledge I had. That fear will make some of them more careful about who they abuse. My death buys a little protection for others." She paused, then added, "Besides, I'm not certain the plants were all I used. My mother taught me the old ways. Sometimes I think I called something else, something darker to help those plants do their work. I'll never know for sure if it was just poison, or if something else answered when I whispered the old prayers over those preparations. But they'll wonder, and that wondering is worth dying for." This confession was, of course, immediately controversial. Some believed Celeste had genuinely confessed to using poison, and was simply trying to make her death meaningful by perpetuating the supernatural legend. Others believed she had never poisoned anyone and was falsely confessing to give her death some dignity, to make herself the agent of justice rather than a victim of superstition. And some believed that her ambiguity was deliberate, that perhaps she herself didn't know whether she had used poison magic, or some combination of both. At noon on April 15, 1847, Celeste was led to the gallows in Savannah's public square. Her eyes remained covered with the black cloth throughout. She was asked if she had any final words. She said only, "I see you all even with these eyes covered, and I'll keep seeing you long after today." The trapdoor dropped. Celeste of Savannah died at age 26, the last person executed for witchcraft in Georgia, possibly in all of America. But her death did not end the story. In fact, in many ways, it was only the beginning. Within months of Celeste's execution, strange reports began emerging from the Savannah area. Multiple people claimed to see a woman with mismatched eyes watching them from the edges of swamplands, from windows of abandoned buildings, from the shadows at dusk. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A young black woman in the simple clothing of a slave, one brown eye, one pale blue eye, standing absolutely still, just watching. When approached, the figure would vanish. These sightings occurred primarily around the former Whitfield plantation and in locations where Mercer, Whitfield, or Ashford had been known to frequent. Skeptics dismissed these reports as mass hysteria following a sensational trial and execution. But the sightings continued, reported by people who had no knowledge of each other's experiences and no obvious reason to lie. More disturbing were reports from slave owners throughout the region who claimed to have been visited by Celeste in their dreams. These accounts, documented in private letters and journals discovered decades later, describe remarkably similar experiences. Waking in the middle of the night to find a woman with mismatched eyes standing at the foot of their bed, simply staring, saying nothing. When the dreamer would sit up or call out, the figure would vanish. Several plantation owners who reported these dream visits subsequently experienced mysterious illnesses. None died, but all suffered weeks or months of debilitating symptoms that doctors couldn't explain or treat. Some of these men began treating their enslaved people better, convinced that Celeste's spirit was warning them against cruelty. Others became even more brutal, determined not to be intimidated by superstition. Most significant was what happened to the painting that had been made of Celeste in 1834, the one that now resides in the Georgia Historical Society archives. After her execution, the painting had remained in the possession of Margaret Ashford, who planned to destroy it. But servants in her house reported that the painting's eyes seemed to follow them as they moved through rooms, that the blue eye appeared to glow faintly in darkness, that looking at the portrait for too long caused headaches and disturbing dreams. Margaret eventually donated the painting to the Historical Society in 1852, unable to bear having it in her house any longer. The Society accepted it and hung it in their archives, where it has remained ever since. But staff and visitors have consistently reported unusual experiences related to the portrait. The most common report is a sensation of being watched, of feeling those mismatched eyes following you even when you're not looking directly at the painting. Some visitors claim the blue eye appears to change intensity, sometimes appearing pale and watery, other times bright and luminous, as though lit from within. In 1891, when the minister who had heard Celeste's final confession died, his personal papers were donated to a church library. Among them was a private journal that had never been meant for publication. In it, the minister had recorded a far more detailed account of his conversation with Celeste than he had shared publicly. The journal revealed several disturbing details that the minister had kept secret. First, when Celeste had confessed to using poison, she had described specific plants and preparation methods that the minister had later researched and confirmed could produce symptoms matching those experienced by Mercer, Whitfield, and Ashford. This lent credibility to her confession. But she had also described something else, a ritual she had performed before administering each poison, a ceremony borrowed from her mother's Vodou knowledge, in which she had called upon spirits of vengeance, had asked them to guide the poison, to ensure her victims could not escape their deserved fate. More disturbingly, the minister wrote that during their conversation he had briefly made eye contact with Celeste when the guard temporarily removed her blindfold. He described what he saw in her blue eye, a reflection that was not his own face but rather a vision of himself, old, dying, alone. The minister wrote that this vision had haunted him for years, and as he wrote this journal entry in 1890, he noted that the vision was coming true. He was indeed old, dying and alone. He questioned whether Celeste had shown him his future or had somehow caused it through her final gaze. The journal also revealed that the minister had struggled for decades with the question of Celeste's guilt. He had come to believe that she had indeed used poison to kill her 3 victims. But he had never been able to convince himself that poison was all she had used. There was something about her, about those eyes, about the way she had described her rituals that suggested genuine belief in forces beyond the physical and perhaps genuine access to such forces. The minister's final entry on the subject, written weeks before his death, concluded, "I believe Celeste killed those men through poison enhanced by ritual, by belief, by the focusing of will through ceremony. Whether the ritual actually called forth supernatural aid or simply helped her administer the poison with patience and precision, I cannot say. Perhaps there is no difference. Perhaps will directed through ritual is itself a kind of magic, regardless of whether spirits answer the call. But I am certain of this. Something looks out from those eyes in that portrait in the historical society. Something that remembers, and something that watches. And I am grateful I will die before those eyes decide I deserve their attention." In 1923, a researcher named Dr. Margaret Whitmore, no relation to the Whitfield family, became interested in the Celeste case while conducting a broader study of witchcraft accusations in American history. Dr. Whitmore was a botanist and medical historian who approached the case from a scientific perspective, determined to separate fact from superstition. She obtained permission to examine the botanical specimens that had been preserved as evidence from Celeste's quarters. After careful analysis, she identified several plants that, when prepared in specific ways, could produce symptoms matching those documented in the medical reports of Mercer, Whitfield, and Ashford's final illnesses. Most notably, she identified a combination of plants that, when administered in small doses over weeks or months, would accumulate in the body and eventually cause sudden cardiac arrest with few external symptoms, exactly matching how all 3 men had died. Dr. Whitmore's findings were published in the Journal of Medical History in 1925 under the title Botanical Knowledge as Resistance, The Case of Celeste of Savannah. Her paper argued that Celeste had almost certainly used sophisticated botanical knowledge passed down from her mother's Haitian origins to poison her abusers. The paper should have definitively resolved the question of how Mercer, Whitfield, and Ashford died. But it didn't, because Dr. Whitmore also documented something that her scientific training couldn't explain. While conducting her research in Savannah, Dr. Whitmore visited the Georgia Historical Society to examine the portrait of Celeste. She spent several hours studying the painting, taking notes on the artistic technique, the pigments used, the historical context. But during this examination, something happened that she struggled to record objectively in her research. Dr. Whitmore wrote in her private notes, "At approximately 3:47 p.m., while photographing the portrait for my records, I made the mistake of looking directly into the painted blue eye. I experienced what I can only describe as a moment of dissociation. The room seemed to dim. I felt intensely cold despite the warmth of the afternoon. And most disturbing, I had the overwhelming sensation that I was no longer looking at a painting, but rather that something within the painting was looking back at me, examining me with an intelligence that was very much alive. The moment passed in perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, but the sensation was so powerful that I had to leave the archives. I felt physically ill for several hours afterward. As a scientist, I want to attribute this to exhaustion, to psychological suggestion brought on by immersion in this case. But I cannot shake the feeling that I was not alone in that room, that something was present, something connected to those painted eyes. Dr. Whitmore attempted to visit the portrait again several days later to determine if she could replicate the experience under more controlled conditions. But upon approaching the painting, she experienced such severe anxiety that she found herself unable to look at it. She left without completing her intended observations. In her published paper, Dr. Whitmore made no mention of this experience. But her private notes, donated to Duke University after her death in 1967, reveal that she spent the rest of her life torn between her scientific conclusions that Celeste had used poison and her inexplicable personal experience that suggested something more was involved. She wrote in 1964, "I proved that Celeste had the knowledge and the means to poison her victims. I documented the botanical evidence conclusively. By all scientific measures, the case is closed. So why, after 40 years, do I still sometimes wake at night with the sensation of being watched by mismatched eyes? Why have I never been able to look at a photograph of that portrait without feeling dread? Science explains the deaths, but it does not explain the portrait, it does not explain the dreams, and it does not explain what I felt that afternoon in the archives. The story of Celeste might have faded into historical obscurity if not for the persistence of reported sightings well into the modern era. Between 1950 and 2020, over 200 documented reports of encounters with the woman with witch eyes have been filed with local authorities, historical societies, and paranormal investigation groups. These reports follow several consistent patterns. The most common is a sighting in or near the swamplands surrounding what was once the Whitfield plantation. Witnesses describe seeing a young black woman in period clothing, always at dusk or dawn, standing absolutely still and watching. When approached, she vanishes, but not in the manner of a ghost fading away. Witnesses consistently describe her as simply no longer being there when they blink or look away and then look back. The second pattern involves the portrait at the Georgia Historical Society. Security cameras installed in the archives in 1998 have captured several anomalies. On multiple occasions, typically during overnight hours when the building is closed, the cameras show what appears to be a subtle change in the portrait's appearance. The blue eye appears brighter, more luminous. The angle of the gaze seems to shift, as though tracking movement in the room. Technical analysis has never found evidence of tampering, and the cameras themselves function normally before and after these episodes. Most disturbing are the documented cases of people who have claimed to be cursed by Celeste. Since 1950, 17 individuals have reported the following sequence of events. 1. They learned about Celeste's story, often through local folklore or historical research. 2. They visited either the portrait at the Historical Society or the location of the former Whitfield plantation. 3. They experienced a vivid dream or waking vision of a woman with mismatched eyes staring at them. 4. They developed a series of unexplained medical symptoms matching those described in the deaths of Mercer, Whitfield, and Ashford. Of these 17 cases, 3 died despite medical intervention. The others eventually recovered after weeks or months of illness that doctors could not definitively diagnose. Skeptics point out that all of these individuals knew about Celeste before their symptoms began, suggesting psychosomatic illness triggered by suggestion and fear. But the 3 who died present a more challenging problem for skeptical explanations. One case from 2003 is particularly well documented. A graduate student named Michael Harrison was researching Southern folk beliefs for his dissertation. He visited the Whitfield plantation site and took photographs. He reported feeling watched while there, but attributed this to knowledge of the location's dark history. That night, he had a vivid dream of a woman with one brown eye and one blue eye standing at the foot of his hotel bed, simply staring at him. He woke feeling deeply disturbed, but again attributed it to having spent the day immersed in a disturbing story. Within a week, he began experiencing symptoms: difficulty sleeping, nightmares, disorientation, a sensation of weight on his chest at night. He consulted multiple doctors. Every test came back normal. His symptoms intensified. He began having visual hallucinations, seeing shadows move wrong, seeing faces in reflections that vanished when he looked directly at them. 2 months after visiting the plantation site, Michael Harrison died in his sleep. The autopsy found no clear cause of death. His heart had simply stopped. He was 28 years old with no history of cardiac problems. His death was ruled as sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, a diagnosis used when young, seemingly healthy people die suddenly without explanation. Before his death, Harrison had written in his research journal, "I no longer believe I am investigating a historical legend. I believe something from that history is investigating me. I see those eyes everywhere now, in mirrors, in windows, in the dark when I close my own eyes. I think I understand now why those 3 men died, not because of poison or curses or coincidence. They died because they abused someone who refused to stay abused. Someone who found a way, through knowledge or will or something beyond both, to ensure they paid for what they had done. And I think I'm paying now, not for abusing anyone, but for disturbing something that should have been left alone." In 2015, construction work near the former site of Savannah's old jail required archaeological survey of the area. During this survey, researchers discovered an unmarked grave they suspected might contain Celeste's remains, as executed criminals in the 1840s were often buried in unmarked plots near the jail. With permission from the state of Georgia and several descendant communities, the grave was carefully exhumated. The remains were indeed consistent with a young black woman who died in the mid-1800s. But 2 discoveries made during this exhumation reignited all the old questions about Celeste and her supposed powers. First, forensic analysis of the remains revealed the presence of several unusual compounds in the bone tissue. These compounds were consistent with long-term exposure to the toxic plants Dr. Whitmore had identified in 1925. This suggested that Celeste had been experimenting with these poisons on herself, possibly building up immunity to certain compounds or testing their effects. This finding supported the theory that she had sophisticated botanical knowledge and had used it deliberately to kill her abusers. But the second discovery was more disturbing and less easily explained. Celeste had been buried with her eyes covered with the black cloth that had been placed over them before her execution. That cloth, preserved by the particular soil conditions, was carefully removed during the exhumation. When researchers examined the skull, they found something inexplicable. Both eye sockets contained what appeared to be small, smooth stones, one dark and one pale. Further analysis revealed these weren't stones, but rather glass prosthetic eyes, though of a type and quality that shouldn't have existed in 1847. The technology to create realistic glass eyes wasn't developed until decades later. Yet these were remarkably sophisticated, with detailed irises and a lifelike quality. Most disturbing, the pale eye, representing Celeste's blue eye, appeared to have some kind of luminescent quality. When exposed to darkness and then to light, it glowed faintly for several seconds, as though it had absorbed and was now releasing light energy. No one could explain where these glass eyes had come from, why they had been placed in Celeste's eye sockets, presumably after death, or how they possessed properties that seemed technologically impossible for the 1840s. The research team, led by Dr. Amanda Torres, a forensic anthropologist, documented everything meticulously. But Dr. Torres also reported several unsettling experiences during the exhumation and subsequent analysis. She wrote in her field notes, "On 3 separate occasions during the examination of the remains, I experienced brief but intense episodes of vertigo and disorientation. Each episode occurred while I was directly observing the prosthetic eyes. I also experienced vivid and disturbing dreams during the 2 weeks of this project, always featuring a woman with mismatched eyes who would stare at me without speaking. I am not a superstitious person. I am a scientist. But I have never experienced anything like this during any other exhumation in my 20-year career. Something about this case feels different. Something about those eyes, even glass reproductions of them, carries something I don't have words to describe." The prosthetic eyes were eventually placed in the Georgia Historical Society archives, stored in a sealed container in a climate-controlled vault. They are not on public display. Staff members who have seen them report the same sensation described by Dr. Torres, a sense of unease, of being watched, of something present that shouldn't be. One staff member, speaking anonymously, said, "I know those are just glass and paint. I know there's nothing alive about them. But I can't shake the feeling that something is looking out through them, that whoever placed those eyes in her skull after her death was trying to ensure that her gaze would continue even after her body had decayed. And looking at them, I believe they succeeded." Following the 2015 exhumation, a group identifying as descendants and spiritual inheritors of Celeste's community came forward with their own perspective on the story. Led by a woman named Marie Baptiste, who claimed descent from Celeste's mother's line, this group offered an interpretation that challenged both the skeptical scientific narrative and the supernatural folk legend. According to Baptiste and her community, Celeste was neither a simple poisoner nor a supernatural witch, but rather a practitioner of voodoo who had used both botanical knowledge and spiritual practice in her resistance against her oppressors. They argued that trying to separate the scientific explanation, poison, from the supernatural explanation, curse, was a false dichotomy rooted in Western dualistic thinking. In Vodou tradition, the spiritual and material are not separate realms but different aspects of the same reality. Baptiste explained, "When Celeste prepared her plants, she wasn't just mixing compounds. She was working with the spirits those plants carried. When she performed her rituals, she wasn't just reciting empty words. She was calling on ancestral forces to guide and empower her resistance. To ask, was it poison or was it magic, misses the point. It was both. The poison was the physical manifestation of spiritual will. The spirits were the guiding force that made the poison effective. You can't separate them any more than you can separate a person's body from their soul while they're alive." The descendant community also offered a different interpretation of the continued sightings and the strange effects associated with Celeste's portrait and remains. Rather than seeing these as evidence of a vengeful ghost or as mass hallucination, they described them as ongoing spiritual presence. "Celeste is not a ghost wandering because she died angry," Baptiste explained. "She is an ancestor who maintains presence because her work is not finished. As long as there is oppression, as long as there are people who abuse power over others, her spirit remains active, watching, warning, and occasionally acting. Those who see her are receiving a message. Those who feel afraid are recognizing that their actions or their complicity has been witnessed." This interpretation has gained traction in certain academic circles, particularly among scholars studying the intersection of African spiritual traditions, resistance to slavery, and historical memory. Several papers have been published arguing that Celeste represents a tradition of spiritual resistance that was systematically erased from mainstream historical narratives, and that the persistence of her story, the continued sightings, and the powerful effects of her portrait and remains represent a form of historical memory that cannot be suppressed or rationalized away. In 2018, the descendant community conducted a ceremony at the site of Celeste's execution, acknowledging her as an ancestor, honoring her resistance, and, in their words, allowing her spirit to rest knowing she is remembered, and her actions are understood as righteous self-defense rather than criminal violence. Since that ceremony, reported sightings of the woman with witch eyes have decreased significantly, from an average of 15 per year in the decade before 2018 to only 3 per year in the years since. This could be coincidence or suggestion, or, as the descendant community believes, evidence that acknowledging and honoring Celeste's true story has allowed some of her spiritual presence to ease. But the portrait still hangs in the Georgia Historical Society. The prosthetic eyes still rest in their sealed container, and people who visit these artifacts still report with remarkable consistency the sensation of being watched by something that is both present and absent, both historical and contemporary, both dead and somehow still aware. The case of Celeste of Savannah resists easy resolution. The scientific evidence suggests she used sophisticated botanical knowledge passed down from her mother to poison 3 men who had abused her. This explanation is supported by forensic analysis, historical documentation, and modern botanical science. But this explanation, while factually solid, doesn't fully account for everything associated with this case. The consistent reports of sightings over 170 years, the strange effects experienced by people who examine her portrait or remains, the mysterious prosthetic eyes that shouldn't have existed in 1847, the documented cases of people dying after learning about Celeste and experiencing the vision of her mismatched eyes. Perhaps, as the descendant community suggests, we need to expand our framework for understanding such cases. Perhaps Celeste was both a poisoner and something more. Someone who understood that material action and spiritual will are not separate but intertwined. Perhaps her eyes were both a genetic quirk and a genuine channel for spiritual sight. Perhaps her resistance was both grounded in physical knowledge and empowered by forces that our current scientific framework cannot measure or explain. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and stranger. That belief itself has power. That Celeste's story has become so embedded in collective consciousness that it continues to manifest effects through suggestion, through expectation, through the human mind's capacity to create experiences that conform to cultural narratives. In this interpretation, Celeste's legend has taken on a life of its own, independent of the historical woman. And that legend continues to shape experiences and events because people believe in it strongly enough to make it real in practical terms. What we can say with certainty is this: 3 men died under mysterious circumstances between 1834 and 1846. An enslaved woman named Celeste, who had unusual eyes and knowledge of plants, was executed for their deaths. And in the 177 years since her execution, hundreds of people have reported experiences that they attribute to her continued presence. Whether that presence is spiritual, psychological, or some combination of both, it remains powerful. Celeste of Savannah, the girl with witch eyes, the last woman executed for witchcraft in Georgia, the poisoner and the priestess, the victim and the avenger, refuses to fade into mere history. She watches still, from portraits and from swamps, from dreams and from the edges of vision. And those who encounter her are left to decide for themselves. Are those eyes dangerous because of what Celeste did with her botanical knowledge and her ritual practice? Or because of what we, the living, project onto them through our fear, our guilt, and our inability to fully reckon with the violence of our past? The eyes watch, the questions remain. And the boundary between history and legend, between the natural and supernatural, between the dead and the somehow still present, remains as uncertain and unsettling as Celeste's mismatched gaze itself. If this story has disturbed you, made you question the boundaries between science and spirituality, between justice and revenge, between historical fact and persistent legend, then it has done what Celeste's story has always done. Refused easy answers, challenged comfortable categories, and reminded us that some truths exist in the spaces between what we can prove and what we can explain. Remember Celeste. Remember that she was a real person who lived and suffered and resisted. Remember that she had knowledge that her oppressors feared. Remember that she found a way through means we may never fully understand to make her oppressors pay for their cruelty. And remember that her story persists because it carries a truth that transcends the specifics of 1840s Georgia. That those who are oppressed will find ways to resist, that knowledge is power even when all other power is stripped away, and that some gazes once encountered are never forgotten. The portrait hangs in the Georgia Historical Society. The prosthetic eyes rest in their sealed container. The swamplands around Savannah remain dark and ancient. And somewhere in those spaces, in the overlap between memory and present, history and myth, the material and the spiritual, two eyes watch still. One brown, one blue, and both unforgetting.